This is alexsachon. Welcome back to the Wisdom Tradition Podcast. Today I want to announce that my book on Manly P. Hall is finally available in print form. It's on Amazon, and you can get it throughout North America and Europe and even Japan, and you can get it prime shipping. It goes for $17.95, and it's based on the series that I originally did on my Substack and podcast, which you may be familiar with if you're a regular listener. But I took a whole week and went through the whole thing and re-edited it and made some improvements and updates, and I'm really happy with how it came out. I'm also really happy with the cover design. I think it looks really good. And so I just want to kind of recap and go over what the book is about and what my aim was for making it, and to get you pumped to go get a copy of it. So there are 6 chapters. The first one's called An Emissary of the Mystery Schools. Then there's America's Philosopher in a Time of War. Chapter 3 is The Philosophy of the UFO. Chapter 4 is Initiation in the Modern Age. Chapter 5 is Philosophy, Religion, and Science, a Synthesis. And Chapter 6 is The Destiny of Philosophy. So the first 2 chapters are really long. They're each about 40 to 50 pages each. And these have a kind of a dual goal. One of them is to go over some key aspects of Manly P. Hall's life that are often overlooked by historians of his. In particular, I'm referencing the biographer Louis Sahagun, who wrote his kind of mainstream biography, which is called Master of the Mysteries, which is informative, but Sahagun is not really a scholar of the esoteric tradition, nor do I think is he necessarily a believer in any of the core teachings of it. So he kind of looks at Manly Hall more as a curiosity. And I get the feeling that some of the other prominent historians of Manly Hall, such as Mitch Horowitz, and some of the sort of leaders of the current PRS, which is the Philosophic Research Society that Manly Hall founded, that they're not necessarily as passionate or enthusiastic about Manly Hall's core ideas as maybe some of you are, and as you know, I am. So my goal here is to go through some key elements of Manly Hall's life, but then to also show how these indicate that he himself was an ambassador and representative of the esoteric tradition, and more specifically the mystery schools that he talks about so frequently in his writings. And so I kind of make the case that he was an initiate of this mystery school institution, which is ultimately a metaphysical institution. It has different ambassadors that exist on Earth. And so that gives him the authority and the capacity to tell us in detail about certain things that you could only get if you were somebody who had the sort of clairvoyant and psychic capacities to go inward and communicate with the gods, so to speak. And in some of the later chapters of the book, I go into some of his descriptions, as I have in previous works of mine, but I go into some of his descriptions of the mystical experience, the experience of illumination and enlightenment, and what he has to say about it. And he really has just the most beautiful descriptions of what it's like to have the individual soul merge into the consciousness of the world soul, and then to even go beyond that into the mysteries of absolute unity. And so these are the type of things that you won't get in any other book, this type of analysis of his, really mystical teachings and mystical content. And, this is the kind of thing that's only valuable if you are somebody who really believes in the ideas that he talks about. And if you just look at it as a curiosity, you're prone to overlook certain aspects of his teachings, such as his mystical and metaphysical elements of what he put out. So my goal here was to really show that Manly Hall was a representative and an ambassador of something that, almost everybody overlooks, which is the idea that there is a metaphysical hierarchy of beings who is the true invisible government of the world, as he says. And that the physical planet is the lowest manifestation of creation, and it is surrounded by a hierarchy of levels that ascend into absolute unity. And there's no real way to understand the mysteries of human life and earthly existence without reference to this oversoul, this invisible government, so to speak. So I'm just going to go over some of the sections here. I went over the chapters, but the first chapter is called Manly Hall, an Emissary of the Mystery Schools. And this is sort of my introduction to the man himself, but also the idea of what the mystery schools are and what they represent. And I note specifically that, Manly Hall carried out his life's work at a very critical time in human history, which was the 20th century. And I have a whole nother book that I wrote, and it's already been out on my podcast and on my Substack, but I'm going to turn into a book. That's my next project. But it's called The Secret History of the 20th Century, and it talks about why the 20th century was so significant and what happened in this period. And so, it was no mistake that Manly Hall came and gave the lessons that he did during this period. And they are as relevant for us today as they were back during his lifetime, because I think this is the time when we're intended to harvest these lessons and harvest these teachings and put them into use. I feel like the doctrine he gave out was not necessarily intended to be actualized in his lifetime, but he left a legacy that we're intended to pick up and carry forth and to actualize. If you go back to the whole series that I've done, and the whole overarching series is called Philosophy, Its Origin, Purpose, and Destiny, and it begins with Atlantis, which was the first publication I ever did, and I have a few physical copies left. If you want to go to my store at thewisdomtrician.bigcartel.com, you can get one of those. But that first publication, which was called Atlantis and the Origins of Civilization, which I would like to one day redo and kind of update and get on Amazon. But the point of that was to start things at the very beginning and to look at Atlantis and how it fits into a larger cycle of creation, of cosmic creation, and an idea of one great cycle being partitioned into 7 subcycles. And Atlantis was a subcycle before ours, and we're currently in the next phase of human development, which is called the Arya. And so starting from that point, my goal was to go piecemeal through time, starting with classical civilization, and I have a whole book on Plato, a whole one on Pythagoras and the philosophy of number, and esoteric Buddhism. And these are intended to go into the deep history and to look at ancient civilization and the mystery schools and the emergence of philosophy. And then I move upward through time gradually by looking at the development of things in the Middle Ages that have to do with the book on Francis Bacon that I did. I also talk about the Mayan civilization and the ancient American history and relate that to Atlantis. That's another book in the series. And keep in mind, all this stuff is based on Manly Hall's teachings. He's my primary reference point in all these books, except for the book on the 20th century. And I'll return to why that is in a minute. But the whole arch of this series was to sort of build up through time, not only a story of history, civilization, but in each of those to progress our understanding of what philosophy is and what it's intended to teach us, and what the sort of parameters are of its vision of the world, its sort of spiritual worldview, so to speak. And so this book on Manly Hall comes as the 9th book in that series. And so it moves up through time, and it's supposed to pair with my book on his Secret History of the 20th Century, because he lived during the 20th century. And so the book on the Secret History of the 20th Century, which is the only book that is not based on his teachings, but it's meant to provide this context of these world changes that were taking place over the course of the past 150 years, and the significance of those changes. And then this book is intended to show how this whole ancient tradition that I was developing in these early works, how it's still alive today. And Manly Hall is a sort of proof of its existence. In this particular book, I focus on his teachings in modern times and what he had to say about contemporary developments that were taking place, and then to relate them to this whole story I've been telling through all these other books. So that's the overarching goal for this work. And so in his life, he, to me, represented a sort of emissary and ambassador in the modern age for the mystery schools. And in that way, he picked up the sort of torch, so to speak, from Helena Blavatsky, who was similarly an ambassador in her own time and was performing an act of service and sort of a mission on behalf of this esoteric institution, this metaphysical institution. So the next section in this first chapter is called An Encyclopedist of the Esoteric Tradition. And this is going into what the sort of core mission of, or one of at least Manly Hall's core missions was, which was to sort of wade into this scenario that started to develop after Helena Blavatsky came into prominence and distributed her powerful works. He kind of came to synthesize and simplify what she was doing with the secret doctrine and Isis Unveiled, but also to add to it and give further detail. And so what exemplifies his approach is his great magnum opus, which was published when he was still in his 20s, which is The Secret Teachings of All Ages. But it doesn't stop there. Like his whole career, all the lectures and articles and books that he wrote were all based on this task of articulating the esoteric tradition and giving it order and organization. And what he did was he scattered his analysis of the various topics he talks about through all his lectures and articles and books. And so what my approach has been to go through that material and try to reorganize it and try to take all the content he wrote on particular topics, or at least the key works on particular topics that are scattered in different lectures and articles and books, and to bring them into one place. So when I talk about Plato, I'm bringing together material from his books and his lectures and his articles and trying to put it together, and then I add my own little pieces and bits to it. But that's sort of the overall goal. And so likewise in this book, I take teachings that he had scattered throughout various works throughout the decades and bring them together to talk about what his key ideas were about what's going on with civilization and human development in the modern age, and what the key trends are and what we can learn from them to apply to the future. Because like I said, I think we're supposed to learn and apply what he taught today. It wasn't supposed to happen in his lifetime, but in the same way that the Great Reformation wasn't going to happen in Francis Bacon's lifetime, but he's laid the groundwork for the future transformation of society if we can learn from and build on his works. So the Encyclopedist of the Esoteric Tradition is the next section in this first chapter. Then I talk about, in this third section, the ordination of Manly Hall. And this is something I've never heard anybody talk about, but it's based on one of his early articles written in his early 20s when he was first coming out. And it has to do with a story that he has in his journal, The All-Seeing Eye, about his own experience of sort of being initiated, more or less, by an old Indian shaman, a Native American shaman. And so that's the orientation of this section here. And, the point is to show how Manly Hall sort of came into the knowledge that he had. And that's the great mystery, is like, he comes in his late teenage, early 20 years with this profound knowledge. It's like an intuitive grasp on this esoteric tradition. And so I talk about how when he was young, it's clear that he did learn a certain amount, particularly in his teenage years when he was in New York. He did learn a certain amount of his knowledge, or gain it, from studying in the New York Library and also reading the work of Blavatsky. And so he did have a certain amount of studying and books and learning that he did learn from, but he also clearly had access to an inner realm of knowledge, and he states this explicitly in his work. And so my goal here in that section, the ordination of Manly Hall, and then also in the next section that follows, which is called Manly Hall, a True Initiate, is to talk about how, early on it's clear that he was somebody who was initiated into the higher mysteries. And part of the point here is to emphasize the idea that, and this is something that he says, that initiation is not something that requires necessarily a participation in an outside organization. It's something that actually happens in terms of your own relationship to your higher self, so to speak, and to the gods, and to the metaphysical realm that surrounds us. That's the true initiation. And so, the goal is ultimately to fashion a human terrestrial institution that will facilitate that. But in the absence of that, like today, there's sort of an absence of this public-facing institution that was once the mystery schools. It's gone underground. So in lieu of that, the process of initiation is really something that we should understand we are going through in our sort of our whole lifespan. That this world that we're born into and inhabiting is very much the great temple of initiation, and that each of us is being guided by our own sort of spiritual self toward the purposes of that greater self that it has for incarnating itself into this world. So that's initiation, is this process of the spiritual world and our connection to that spiritual world guiding us and facilitating our own evolution. So really, like, initiation is about self-evolution. It's about consciously participating in nature's evolutionary processes. And so that, again, ties into this idea that the world is a great temple of initiation. And so Manly Hall was a old soul, so to speak. That's what one prominent Mason who knew Manly Hall later in his life called him, an old soul. And that's an apt description. So he was born to fulfill a purpose and do all that, the things that he did, because he was somebody who, in previous lifetimes had reached a certain stage of accomplishment beyond what most of us today have achieved or will achieve, but in a future lifetime are destined to achieve. But he's somebody who was very old and accomplished, and so he was, in a way, living out a life to prepare him for the next stage in his spiritual growth process. And so he was a true initiate of the type that he talks about when he talks about Plato and Francis Bacon. I'm not saying that they're necessarily all on the same level, but they're of the same degree, I would say. So he was somebody who, while not perfect, and he says that none of these people of myth were actually perfect. Like, you would be, he warns us that you would be surprised at some of the imperfections of these people who we look back and deify. But the idea is, if you were at a certain level of perfection, you would not be able to incarnate back here on Earth. So there's this idea that your final incarnation, you're playing out very heavily whatever is left in terms of unresolved karma. But it's that karma that draws you back into incarnation. So even the great sages have this one last incarnation. But once you truly liberate yourself from the wheel of samsara, as they say, then your existence becomes eternal in this metaphysical realm. And you become part of this invisible government of the world, meaning you're still involved in the happenings of the world and the long-term evolution, but you're projecting your influence now on the level of the what we would consider the unconscious or the collective conscious. And so anyway, Manly Hall was a true initiate in that sense. It's not about your involvement in a terrestrial organization. It's about the level of consciousness you've achieved in terms of reincarnation, life after life, and sort of the overall maturity of the soul and the integration of the lower self with the higher self. So then I move on, and I use all discussion to now segue into a discussion of the God concept in esoteric philosophy. Again, citing Manly Hall, I'll just give one quote here. He says, "Our God is an infinite, immeasurable, unformed, impersonal one. He is the first without a second. He is the sum of everything. He is the one thing from which all things come. Division exists within him, but he is not divided. Separateness is tolerated for a moment in the building of worlds, but he is God because he is without the sense of separateness." And then he continues, "In God we live and move and have our being. He is the sum of all of us. Whatever Caesar speaks for him, for he is the voice, the speech, and the speaker." And he goes on, but I just want to note that this quote was from his early 20s. So this is the way he was talking, this kind of wisdom and knowledge and understanding of the nature of truth and wisdom he had from this early age. And if you track his teachings over the course of time, you go decades later to when he was in his 80s, his message was not different. His description of God was not different. So he was like almost fully formed at this early age, and that's what I'm talking about, a true initiate. This is someone who was born with this level of wisdom encoded in his soul. He had developed it over previous lifetimes. So then next is a discussion of, having talked about the God concept, we're now going to move into this idea that God is creation, that all things are actually God, and there's a cycle that's happening of a descent and then a reascent. And so while the aspect of God that's moved into creation has descended into an experience of material form and individuality and personality and separateness, which is what we all experience, that there is an aspect of him that does not divide. So there's a higher aspect that doesn't descend into the materialism, but remains in this in the upper echelons of the metaphysical realm. And this is the realm of the gods, so to speak, or the demigods and the enlightened adepts and the rishis and bodhisattvas. So when you put this together, this becomes what he calls the Great White Lodge. So this is the aspect of God that's in creation but is not lost in the illusion. And there's a sort of a descent of this. And this descent moving down into creation culminates with the mystery schools. So the mystery schools is the spiritual institution of the gods, so to speak. And it's this sort of liaison between the illusion of material existence and then the enlightenment of oneness that is characteristic of those who are members of this so-called Great White Lodge. So that's what that section's about. And then included in this is a description of the various levels of the mystery schools in terms of how you ascend upwards from the illusions of materiality, gaining entrance into this enlightened level of having the God consciousness reawakened within you. So it begins at the neophyte level, then moves to the disciple, and then culminates with the master. So then, so I give his descriptions of what these various levels are. And again, this is amazing because he wrote all this stuff in his 20s, early 20s. And then the next section tries to link those ideas I just discussed with some of the things that Helena Blavatsky was saying in her earlier work about her connection to the Mahatmas. So for her, the Mahatmas was her connection to this Great White Lodge, so to speak. And the secret doctrine, according to her herself, was a production actually of certain members of this lodge that she was working as an emissary and ambassador for. So she was an initiate at a lower level and was working on behalf of, almost as a channel of a set of higher initiates, which she calls the Mahatmas. And so I talk about that and relate this back to Manly Hall's work. So that discussion right there is the first chapter, all that I was talking about. So the goal of the second chapter, which is America's Philosopher in a Time of War, is to talk about the significance of what Manly Hall was teaching in the 1940s. Because what happened was in the 30s, early 30s, he stopped his initial journal that he was doing, which was called the All-Seeing Eye. And there was a period of a break where he was publishing books, but he didn't have a periodical, a normal periodical that was monthly or quarterly. But he did start that back up right when World War II began. And in those articles from the 40s and then immediately after the war in the 50s, for me, that's some of his most important work, his most vital work that I recommend the most strongly of almost anything, is that series of journals that he put out in the 40s and in the 50s. And that new journal was called Horizon. And you can gain access to that, as I did, on the invaluable website, manlyphall.info. And it's run by a guy named Alan Harris, who's a super nice guy. And he did this incredible work of uploading this whole archive of journals for you to gain access to. And I had no idea that this exists until 2020. So in 2020, I had this just euphoric moment when I already gone through a lot of his Manly Hall's lectures and books, but I had no idea that these I knew the journals existed, but I never knew I could gain access to them and that they were online. And then I discovered that website in 2020. I went through all the journals and got all the key articles I really wanted to read and printed them out and put them in notebooks. And then I spent a long time going through them all. And a lot of the work I do in all my books, not just this one, but all my books, is based around those journal articles. And I also reference the books and lectures, but I really heavily lean on those articles, and they're incredible. So the goal of the second chapter is to go into what he was saying about World War II and sort of his philosophical analysis of it. But there's also another aim of this chapter, which is to talk about his role in resurrecting the imagery that would later go onto the dollar bill in the 1930s. So in 1928, 1927, in his famous book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, he talks about the lost imagery of America's Great Seal, which was first set up by the descendants of Francis Bacon's Rosicrucian Order. And this is the image of the all-seeing eye and pyramid, and also the eagle, which is a disguised phoenix. So we have the phoenix and the all-seeing eye pyramid, and those are two of the hallmark symbols of the mystery schools. And those were established as the Great Seal of this country at the time of its founding. So he resurrects those in the late 20s. And then in the 30s, I discuss in this chapter his relationship to a number of key figures that were involved in the putting of that symbol on the US dollar bill, where it remains to this day. So this is one of the most significant aspects of Manly Hall's life, that you can connect him not only as being a great philosophy teacher, but also somebody who was maybe a player behind the scenes in terms of shaping certain things that happened. And, you know, we can connect him, at least there was some level of connection or some knowledge of Manly Hall by the people who put that symbol on the dollar bill. That doesn't mean that those people were themselves great initiates. There was networks of Freemasons involved, but this is something I made clear in my earlier series on Francis Bacon. Masonry has always been the outer vehicle, and the Rosicrucian order was the higher sort of metaphysical group that sort of overshadowed, at least for certain periods of time, not always, but certain periods of time, the outer body of Masonry. And then Manly Hall himself states that there was a time long ago after the founding of the country where there was a separation between the two. And so the Rosicrucian order moved into a new body. And so the Masonic network developed without that oversouling presence. So we have to kind of keep that in mind, is that there is something special preserved within Masonry, but we can't necessarily assume that just because you're a Mason that you're therefore illumined or enlightened or knowledgeable even about the more profound aspects of esoteric philosophy. Historically, been more of a network that's been drawn upon at certain times. And we know that network was drawn upon during the founding of the country. In this chapter, we're looking at how a certain elite element of that network was leveraged to accomplish this goal of seeding this symbolism onto the dollar bill. And so I talk about that and what the significance of the symbols mean in this second chapter. So I specifically talk about what Manly Hall himself says about the meaning of these symbols. And I also talk about why I think it's significant at this critical point in time, right around World War II, which is the period of time when America took over as the global empire of the world, how it's so significant that this symbolism goes into the most important single artifact of this period of time over the past 100 years, which is the US dollar. And so I also go into the symbolism of the eagle and how the eagle is a lower expression of the higher phoenix archetype. So there's a certain significance to the fact that it's not a phoenix that's on the dollar bill, it's the eagle. And the eagle is sort of the manifestation of the materialistic phase of human existence. The US empire, US dollar, becomes the manifestation of that phase. So the phoenix is the archetype that we're striving for, and the eagle is the reality that we're going through to one day achieve that higher archetype. I also talk about what he says about the causes and purposes of World War II, and he talks about reincarnation, both on an individual but also a collective sense. And sorry for the train in the background. It's just where I live, there's a lot of trains. So I talk about the causes and purposes of war and relate them to the metaphysics of human evolution. And then kind of conclude with Plato's vision for the philosophic empire and how that relates to this destiny of America, which is something I talked about frequently in many of my earlier books, such as the one on America and the one on Francis Bacon. The third chapter is called The Philosophy of the UFO, and this really gets into contemporary issues. So one of the main themes of my previous work on the history of the 20th century was to talk about this untold story of secret science, a hidden paradigm of science, and how that went classified around the turn of the century, and how this paradigm of science relates to the secret knowledge and science of how UFOs work, and that UFOs are actually the product of this secret institution and not of aliens. And so I spent a long time developing that thesis in that earlier work, and I deliberately did not cite Manly Hall almost at all in that series because I knew I wanted to talk about Manly Hall's work on UFOs in this current book. So the focus of this chapter is to go over Manly Hall's teachings about UFOs, and he comes to the same conclusions I developed citing other researchers, contemporary researchers in that earlier work. So there's a alignment here between what Manly Hall was saying in the 40s, 50s, and 60s about this phenomenon and how he believed it was the product of a secret government research program, and how it wasn't ultimately about aliens. And he talks about how aliens is an unphilosophic idea because it implies the existence of an other. And, in philosophy, there is no other. All diversity is consolidated within unity. And, one of the keys here is understanding that this idea of aliens and other civilizations has, there's baked into that certain assumptions about space, which are unphilosophical. So this sort of Einsteinian approach to space, of relativity, so to speak. So I talk about that in the earlier book on the 20th century. So the key to understanding space is that that's not the reality of space as a vacuum. Instead, there's this idea of space as a fullness of energy, an etheric field, and that's all encompassing. And so that becomes the gateway into understanding metaphysics. And so that is kind of the angle that I approach this topic of UFOs from. And this is something that Manly Hall goes into in the philosophy of the UFO, this third chapter. So one of the things I do is I take this idea of space that we were just talking about and link it into mysticism. So I have a section called the internal exploration of space, and this goes into some of Hall's teachings about the mystical experience and sort of how the experience of illumination or enlightenment involves the expanding of consciousness from its localization in place, which is within the body, and the return of it back into a universalized condition. So oneness with space, in other words. And then I also talk about how space serves as the gateway to the spiritual hierarchy. So the idea that space is this sort of etheric field is actually the home of the gods and the demigods, so to speak, and the enlightened souls of humanity. So you have a permanent existence in space when you sort of transcend the cycle of samsara. And then I conclude that with this idea of the coming space age, which is the idea that, the sort of golden age of the future is one where we build a civilization here that becomes in tune with and at one with this greater spiritual hierarchy. And so heaven and earth become in alignment together. And that's the goal. The fourth chapter is called Initiation in the Modern Age. And the goal here is to really talk about the role of the mystery schools and the modern world. And, this is one of the key things that Manly Hall gives us access to in a way that no one else really does. Like, he's like the key resource here to understand what the missions and purposes are of the mystery schools and this esoteric institution in the modern age, because it's invisible from public view, but we have certain signposts, such as Manly Hall's teachings and such as the symbolism of the dollar bill. We have certain signposts that tell us or indicate to us that it's still alive and functioning today, and how it's still performing its work of facilitating initiation of collective mankind today. So the mystery schools, as the instrument of the gods, so to speak, its purpose is to bring collective mankind to its ultimate evolutionary destiny of enlightenment, collective enlightenment. And so that involves initiation. So it is also the custodian of mass initiation. And that's the theme of this chapter. And I'll give my conclusion to this first section of this chapter, where I talk about, in my view, in the modern age, the sacred institution of the mystery schools is the driver of world events. This is the function it has always played. It played it in the past, and then it still plays this role today. As the outer institutions of human society have evolved, the mystery schools have evolved alongside them, expressing themselves through a series of changing forms, once custom suited to the needs and dynamics of each age. With the rise of the age of science, industry, capitalism, and democratic politics, it appears that the mystery schools relocated their base of operations into a new vehicle suitable to the challenges of the modern age. And I argue, so in the old age, this vehicle was the old temples, the old temple complexes. So it was located within the institution of religion. Now its new home in the scientific age is within an institution that is predominantly scientific. And this is the entity that in my previous work in the 20th century, I termed the technocratic superstate. This technocratic superstate is not itself the mystery schools, but is the home of this deeper level of the mystery school. So the adepts and initiates have their work is now focused within this technocratic institution, and this institution itself is concealed within the outer structure of U.S. empire, which makes it sound all like it's evil. But we have to understand that the nature of this relationship is one of compartmentalization and secrecy. So the outer body is not aware of what the inner core is doing. And when there's also this idea of, this has to do with free will, because we have the sort of idea that we can carve our own destiny. But then when you factor in astrology and your horoscope, you're understanding that actually each of us is sort of born with a life pattern that is inescapable. And so what our free will is, do we engage with that pattern constructively or destructively? And do we engage with it consciously, or does it have to exert its influence over us unconsciously? And so we're at a time when not only the majority of the outer body of public is unconscious, but also the leadership structure of this inner empire is highly unconscious, as well as, I would argue, many of the members of this so-called technocratic superstate. So they're driven by their unconscious. They're not, they haven't assimilated their own psyche to a point where they become conscious and build a constructive relationship with these archetypal influences within themselves. And so that's how we can have this spiritual institution at the core of something that is profoundly unspiritual, which is this U.S. empire. So there's a type of karmic destiny that's involved with this empire and the way that it works. And that's one of the key ideas to always keep in mind, is that there are no accidents in the universe. There's only law. So if things are manifesting in this horrendous way that we're seeing today, there is some type of order and law behind it. And that order and law and the way it's manifesting has to do with both our own karmic history, but also our lack of assimilation in terms of our psyches, in terms of the balance of our unconscious and our conscious. So the goal, as Carl Jung put it, is to make the unconscious conscious. And as we do that, we change the nature of our relationship with the archetypes that are driving human life and driving events on this world. We change our relationship into a constructive relationship. But as long as we remain unconscious, then these forces will, drive us, and this unconscious relationship will intermix with our past karma, and we'll be driven to reenact these scenes and events from the past, such as empire, like Rome, for example, reincarnating today through America, just as one example. But there's also a lot of karma you can point to manifesting today that has to do with the Middle Ages and the horrors of conquests and crusades and things like that happened before. So all that built up karma that took place in the past has to play itself out. And one of the themes I argue throughout my work is that we're at a point in time, as we're on the cusp of a global civilization, and as we're potentially on the cusp of moving out of a 5,000-year cycle of the Kali Yuga, that there's an intense manifestation of this past karma in this current age, and that explains in part why things are playing out in the way that they are today. This intense suffering is being experienced. So all these factors are coming together, but that's kind of all around this theme of initiation in the modern age. So remember that no matter how much suffering we go through and how horrible things seem, remember there's always there is reincarnation. So there is some karmic meaning to what's happening, and there is some purpose in terms of burning karma. There's a constructive purpose behind that. Ultimately, these experiences are intended to catalyze us to grow. But if we remain unconscious, then there is still nonetheless a type of value in terms of, if you're going to go through the suffering, but you're not conscious enough to use that as a stimulus to grow, there is a type of burning of karma that is still valuable to the development of the soul, because in a way you're liberated in a future incarnation from having to re-go through certain unresolved things from the past. And so in his analysis of World War II, these things all come into play, because when he was looking at, the intense suffering of the war, he particularly gives some examples about Germany and Russia going together and all the suffering and the death that was involved. He talks about it and kind of reframes it from this idea of reincarnation, and shows how there's a type of a necessity to it, and how those souls, despite their suffering and death, and this is not to explain it away, this is really just a philosophical understanding and reframing of the situation. But he's saying that these will all come back again, and that there's a type of significance to these events that are really, the true understanding of them are only really revealed at death, and more fully in the experience of enlightenment. So I talk about that, and I also talk about the necessity of initiation, and how these trials that we're presented with, and the sort of mystery schools that oversee them, how there's a type of necessity in terms of what their actions are. And so this has to do with the idea of human evolution, the fact that mankind is intended to participate constructively in his own evolutionary growth. And so that's kind of the theme of this chapter here about initiation in the modern age. And ultimately, I talk about how the ideal that we should be striving for is the resurrection of philosophy, and the creation of a world university system, with philosophy as its sort of outer face, but the mystery schools as its inner body, and how this is actually the vision of Plato with this idea of the philosophic commonwealth or philosophic democracy, and that also Francis Bacon's vision of, which he added like a scientific element to this, but he was talking about his vision for a world university. So that's how I finish this up and this chapter up, and I talk about how that would be the most constructive way that we could deal with this whole cycle of karma and reincarnation and learning, is and how we can work to make the unconscious conscious, is to have an institution that is specifically designed to bring human souls into a state of discipline and education and positive mutual relationship. And so this is this is the goal that we need to create, is a world university system that is based on the ideals of the mystery schools and of philosophy itself. So that's the end of that chapter. The 5th chapter and the 6th chapter kind of go together, and they have to do with linking together philosophy, religion, and science. And this is one of the core messages that I hope to spread out, that, I was originally influenced by Manly Hall from, that I elaborate a lot on, which is this relationship of philosophy, religion, and science, and how that these three are actually always intended to go together. And that the ills of past civilization, like, the Middle Ages, so to speak, or even the decline of the pagan era, those took place when these three institutions deconstructed from each other, and when religion separated from philosophy. And then likewise, the ills that we see today in terms of the uses and abuses of scientific knowledge happens when science separates itself from its archetypal connection with philosophy and religion. So we have this situation in which we have evidence now, clear evidence of what happens when science and religion each separate themselves from philosophy. How philosophy is meant to be a joining factor between the two and a sort of disciplining factor, and that the true purpose of religion and science cannot actually be revealed and expressed until they are brought into harmony with philosophy once again. So the great need is to actually resurrect philosophy and then bring that into religion and science in order to recreate this trinity. So my goal and the work I do in my future career that I hope to build is to try to really focus on the resurrection of philosophy and bring it from a state of where it is today, which is sort of like this meaningless, confusing institution in which it basically is of no use because there's only like a babble of opinion, basically. And there's all these different sectors and schools of philosophy that all disagree with each other. But my approach is to understand that the word itself comes from Pythagoras. And so if we understand who Pythagoras was and what the context of the time that he lived in, and the idea that he himself was a initiate of the mystery schools, then we understand that actually philosophy is intended to mean a certain thing and nothing else beyond that certain thing. So it's not actually a word that's up for debate or discussion. It's not really something that can be interpreted any way you want it to be. The word itself comes from Pythagoras, and so to reclaim philosophy, we need to go back to the original understanding and context by which the term itself was even born, which is not just Pythagoras, but it's also the great world teachers that emerged around 600 BC, Taoism, Buddhism, that these are all in their own way embody this ideal of philosophy, this archetype of philosophy. And so if we can go back and understand what that archetype is, then we can move into this current context in which there's this babble of confusion about what philosophy means. And then we can correct the situation by shedding everything that's not in alignment with the original vision and purpose of what the term was intended to mean by the great sage who coined it, which is Pythagoras. So this whole chapter is all about talking about the relationship of religion, science, and philosophy and how they are essential to each other. And they kind of go through the whole story of how they became separated and then how there's clearly a need today to bring them back into alignment with each other. And so that's where I talk about in chapter 5, and then I conclude that thought in chapter 6, which is called The Destiny of Philosophy. And that's all about how to reunify philosophy, religion, and science together. And that's the great goal. And I think that is ultimately, might pinpoint that as being the ultimate lesson that Manly Hall has to teach us. He goes through all this ancient history and all these different cultures and talks about all these different traditions. But the point is to make these things understandable so that we can put them into use today. And how do we put them into use? Well, we have to put them into use by means of this institution of philosophy, by means of reframing our understanding of religion, by means of bringing discipline and ethics and a type of metaphysics back into science. And so I talk about all these things. I also talk about mysticism again. I talk about the experience of nirvana as being the pinnacle of religion, not drawing from my own personal experience, but talking about Manly Hall's writings about the topic. The last section of the book is called The Way of the Bodhisattva, and this is really the ideal of the philosopher, walking the philosophic path. The ideal of what that culminates in, I think, was expressed in its highest form in Buddhism, which is concerning the bodhisattva, the ideal of living as the bodhisattva, and that the sort of enlightened soul of each person is a bodhisattva. You become a bodhisattva in your highest evolutionary form. And likewise, the bodhisattvas who were the bestowers of there were the ambassadors of the gods and the bestowers of knowledge to man in the beginning of times, that these were bodhisattvas who originated previously as humans from an earlier cycle who evolved into the highest level of enlightenment. And that when you reach the highest level of enlightenment, you become a bodhisattva. And so the ideal for us today is to become ourselves bodhisattvas, and then ultimately to return in a future cycle of the world to perform the role that they have performed for us. So they're an archetype, and then we're being drawn towards a realization of that archetype, and we will one day become bodhisattvas ourselves. And so that's how the book concludes. And this is, for me, the essential teachings of Manly P. Hall, and was the significance of his life and work. So this all goes into this book. It's called The Maestro of Esoteric Philosophy. Again, it's on Amazon. Even if you've listened to the series, this is a updated, re-edited version, fine-tuned, and I think you'll enjoy having a physical copy of it. So I hope you'll pick one up. Thank you very much.